tent to separate as a tent, as an ohel, that if there's any dead body on the ground, the child who was riding on top of that ox would be protected through the ox. The ox would form as a tent that would contain any possible contamination that's underneath the ox. And the Gemara said, why does that work over there? Why does it work as a sukkah? Because we said that a bed, we said, Rabbi Yehuda said that we would sleep under the bed in a sukkah. And the bed would not act as a separate tent. Because if it would act as a tent, then it would be a hefsek. It would be a separation between the person sleeping under the tent and the sukkah that's on top of the tent. So the Gemara's question is, why is it that the bed doesn't act as a separate tent? So the Gemara says, because the bed is made to sleep on top of the bed, not underneath the bed. So therefore, it doesn't form a tent for the person who's sleeping underneath, because it's not made as a tent. However, the Gemara says the reason why a ox is considered a tent is because an ox, and therefore an ox would serve as a tent to protect the child, is because the ox is actually, Hashem made the ox actually as a tent. How did Hashem make the ox as a tent? Hashem made the ox in a way that the body, the body of the ox, the bones of the ox, the spine of the ox would serve to protect the insides of the ox. It's like a frame, it's like a shelter that contains the inwards of the ox, and therefore it was made actually it was made for the purpose of protection, or serving as a protection, and therefore Hashem made the body of the ox, just like Hashem made the body of even though that pasuk, when the Gemara quotes the pasuk, Oru Basa Talbisheni, that Hashem has clothed the person with skin and flesh. That means there's the skin and the flesh that's inside of a person. You know, you have flesh, you have skin, and Hashem has placed sinews and bones, but the bones should serve as a protection for what's inside of the human being. That's how Hashem made a human being. And certainly, Tosfos points out, certainly an animal, that the body of an animal, the animal goes horizontally. It goes, the animal goes like this. The stomach of the animal, a human being, is vertical, stands so tall. An animal, you see it goes like that this is forming some sort of canopy. So the spine of the animal is coming to serve as a protection, as some sort of protection for what's inside, for the innards of the animal. So therefore, the Torah calls it, and it protects this canopy, this body, this Rashi, the spine of the animal serves to protect what's inside, and therefore it's called a schach. It's called a covering. And since it's called a covering, therefore it will serve to protect what's underneath of it. It's called a tent. And therefore, this is a tent. The spine of the animal is a tent. Therefore, since it's a tent, it will contain any possible contamination that's underneath. So that's what the Gemara says. And one of the comments, Rabbeinu Bachai says, the nefesh of the person, the soul, is called Adam, not the body. The body is only the clothing of the soul. Every person has a shama. You have a soul, and you have, and now, but Hashem gives us the soul. It places the soul inside of us, with the body as the container that contains the soul. And therefore, when a person leaves this world, what left is the container is still there. It's the neshama that has left, and he brings the pasuk. That the pasuk says, Hashem has clothed us with skin and flesh, meaning that's just clothing. Oru basat talbisheni. God has given us skin and given us flesh. That's the physical body. That's the body. That's the clothing, and the soul of the person is what is being dressed with this body. But the spine, but yet the spine that is serving as a protection for what's inside of the person. Okay, so that's what the Gemara. That was a one approach. Then the Gemara says another answer. Viba Yisema. If you want, I will say another. We know that in the fashion industry, your clothing is called. You would say the physical clothing is what you're that's what you're dressed with. The clothing is covering your body. But we have to remember that Hashem made a person that the physical skin and the skin and the flesh is also a clothing, right? That's the clothing for the neshama. So maybe it's something to think about, the fact that when we put on clothing every day, maybe we should think about the fact that we have Hashem made us our body itself is also clothing. It's clothing for this neshama that we have. So I wonder how many people think about the fact that when you're putting on your clothing, you have to remember you already have clothing on, in a certain sense. Naturally, we all have clothing. Our bodies are clothing for our neshama. So we have to think about that idea. We have a spiritual. We have something that we have been covering up in a spiritual sense with our physical body. Or if you want, the Gemara says another explanation of Rabbi Yehuda to explain Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning. But what did Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda said that we used to sleep under the bed in the sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda says the bed is not considered an interruption between you and the schach and the cover of the sukkah. So if you want, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you could go underneath the bed, and now your body is covered by a bed. And yet, even though your body is covered by a bed, we still consider you sleeping in the sukkah. You're still in the sukkah, and it's not a violation because you can't sleep outside the sukkah, but that's called sleeping inside the sukkah because you're in the sukkah. You're underneath the bed. The bed doesn't serve as an interruption. So now the question is, why doesn't the bed serve as an interruption? So the Gemara says, the Sukkah dires keva beina. He says that a sukkah is supposed to be something that's more of a permanent type of dwelling, meaning to say, of course, you're not allowed to build your house. Your house can't be your sukkah. You need to have schach. You need to have some sort of temporary type of covering. It's not your house, but nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda holds you can have a sukkah that's, and I presume his reasoning is because your sukkah has to be similar to your house. That's if your house is more of a fixed structure, so too you can have a sukkah that's higher than 20 amot. We know the rabbis say you can't have a sukkah so high. Can't have a sukkah that's so high. You can't make a 50 feet sukkah. You can't make it a high sukkah. But that resembles more of to make a 50-foot sukkah, 50 feet high. but then it's going to be, you're going to need a good foundation. You're going to need to build very strong, very heavy type of walls. It's going to resemble more of a permanent type of structure. It's going to resemble that. And we want the Sukkah to be more of a temporary idea, because that's what Hashem wants us. The holiday of Sukkot is leave your permanent dwelling and go to a temporary type of dwelling, right? So if you go ahead and if you're going to have a Sukkah, that's one opinion in the Gemara, that the reason why a Sukkah is so high, 50 foot high Sukkah, is invalid, but that generally that's a type of Sukkah that's made in a very similar to a house, and we don't want you to. We want the type of living to be a type of living which is more. The message of the Sukkah is this world is a temporary world, and leave your permanent, comfortable house and go to a more temporary type of dwelling. So that's one of the reasons why a Sukkah that's so high up, it's not good, because it doesn't resemble a temporary type of dwelling. But Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He said you can have a Sukkah that is 50 foot high. Rabbi Yehuda would say you can make a Sukkah that's 50 foot high. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, since he says that a Sukkah would be considered even a fixed dwelling would be proper for a Sukkah. So therefore the Gemara says, "V'havi the Yulatame the Ama Sukkah dirat kevabina." A Sukkah needs to be something more permanent, and since it needs to be something more permanent, so therefore the Sukkah is permanent. The bed is a temporary type of dwelling. So a temporary dwelling does not have the power to knock out the more permanent dwelling that you're in. So when you're in a Sukkah, it's considered more of a permanent type. It's a more permanent type of structure that Rabbi Yehuda said the Sukkah is classified. So when you're in a permanent structure, a fixed structure, and inside a fixed structure you have a bed, and you're underneath the bed. Now, how do we look at the bed? The bed, the space underneath the bed itself is a temporary type of the bed moves. It's very temporary. So that temporary that temporary cover of the bed does not knock out the more permanent structure that you're in. And if you're underneath the bed, we negate that fact that you're underneath the bed. We don't consider that bed is going to interrupt you and separate you from this shelter of the Sukkah, because the shelter of the Sukkah is considered a more permanent thing. So when you're in a permanent shelter and you're in but you're also underneath a temporary shelter, Yehuda says the temporary shelter cannot negate a more permanent shelter. We can't say we look at you, you're under a temporary, you're not under the Sukkah. No, the Sukkah is a more fixed type of dwelling according to Yehuda. So that being underneath the bed will not take you away from being underneath the Sukkah, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda says you will be kosher if you're underneath the bed. You'll be kosher, and it's considered a proper. You're still in the Sukkah. That bed doesn't have the power to negate the schach, the Sukkah above you. Sometimes when you're in let's say if you're sleeping in a Sukkah inside of a Sukkah, right? So we say if you're sleeping in a Sukkah inside of a Sukkah, or one tent, if you could sit, there's a concept that one tent could knock out the other tent. That will separate you from the other tent. But here, when the two tents are different types of tents, they're not equal power. One's a more powerful tent than the other tent. It dominates. And the tent that's temporary, it does not, we don't consider. It says, if Yehuda goes according to his reasoning, the Gemara says the Ama Sukkah dirat kevabina. It needs to be more of a permanent type of structure. And if that's the case, the bed is a temporary structure. And the Sukkah or keva. and a sukkah is a more permanent. V'lo ati oel arai u'mevatel oel keva. A temporary structure like the bed cannot nullify, negate the more permanent structure that you're in, and therefore you are considered still sleeping in the sukkah. So the Gemara asks a question. V'ho Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon, the Amaname Sukkah Deira Keva Bina. Rab Shimon's in the opinion that a sukkah also has to be made in a way that's more of a permanent type of a structure. V'ati oel arai u'mevatel oel keva. So he holds, he's on the same page, like Rabbi Yehuda, that it has to have some sort of, it's identified as a more permanent type of structure, the sukkah, and yet he holds that you can't sleep under the bed, because Rav Shimon was the one in the Mishnah that reported that you can't sleep underneath the bed. Rav Shimon said he was the one who told the story of Tavi, the slave of Rabbi Gamliel, that slept under the bed because since he's a slave, he doesn't have to sleep in a sukkah. So he holds that in general, a person who's obligated in a sukkah cannot sleep under the bed. So we see that even a temporary dwelling like a bed would negate a permanent, a sukkah that's classified as more of a permanent dwelling. So the Gemara says, and yet in a temporary shelter, and negates oel keva. If Shimon says that you have to have 4 walls to a sukkah, because 4 walls is a more permanent type of structure than a 3-wall structure. So, and yet he holds you can't sleep underneath the bed. He says that the temporary structure of the bed would negate the sukkah. So the Gemara answers, B'hapligi. They're arguing in this is what the argument of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. Ma'asava, Rabbi Shimon holds, Atei oel arai u'mevatel oel keva. That a temporary structure, a temporary tent, namely a bed, which has a space between the bottom of the bed and the ground, which could be used to protect what's underneath that space. It could protect your shoes. It could protect the person who wants to sleep under the bed. He holds that a temporary shelter could negate the more permanent shelter of the sukkah. And if you're under this, even though it's temporary, but at the end of the day, you're under some other cover. You're under the cover of the bed. You went under the bed. And going under the bed, and now you're under some other cover, that cover will separate between you and the cover of the schach that's above, right? Imagine if this table was the bed, right? And a guy sleeps under the table, and over here was the schach. So are you going to say that this table separated between you that's under the table and the schach? Now the table, let's say the table is a temporary type of thing. It's not a permanent thing. The table moves. It's similar to a bed that's temporary. So Rav Shimon says, even though it's temporary, but the end of the day is you're under this type of a tent. It's still a tent. It's a temporary tent. It's not a fixed type of structure, but that will separate between you that's under the table and the schach of that's above the table, above you that you're in. That this temporary structure, this bed, will negate the permanent structure on top. However, Yehuda holds lo ati oel arai mevatel keva. This temporary thing, the fact it does not negate the oel keva. It doesn't separate and interrupt you between you and the sukkah, because since it's temporary, we look at you, even if you're sleeping underneath that bed, underneath that table, you're still sleeping in a sukkah, because you're not sleeping in some other structure that's really of permanence. It's just a little bed, it's not it's not significant to really create a separation between you and the bigger picture, the sukkah that you're under. So that ends this Gemara. But like we said, the halacha, the letter of the halacha goes on the opinion that says you cannot sleep under a bed in a sukkah. So if you have such a situation, you cannot, you have a bed, and let's say the bed has a space of the bed. The Gemara also said that we're talking about a bed that's 10 tefachim high, that the structure of the bed is about between 30 and 40 inches off the ground. So there's a height of 2.5 feet or so between the ground and the bottom of the bed. So if a person will find himself in such a situation, you cannot sleep underneath. You can't sleep underneath the bed on during the holiday of Sukkah, because that's going to create an interruption between you and the Sukkah. So it's close to about 2.5 feet and 40. Again, if you have a bed that the top of the bed is, the bottom of the bed to the ground is around between 30 and 40 inches. So that's between 2.5 and 3.5 or so feet. That bed would, if you go underneath that bed, you lie underneath, that will act as a separation between you and the schach on top. Okay. I don't know anyone sleeping under beds, but when there's children, and children might, sometimes you don't know where they go on, they might feel comfortable to sleep under the bed. When you have a very tight sukkah, maybe they might want to sleep under the bed. And let's say the child's of age that is obligated in sukkah, right? A child at young ages are very obligated. We train the child to sleep in the sukkah. So that child would not be able to go underneath that bed and sleep underneath that bed. Okay. Amar Rav Shimon. So the Gemara continues. Amar Rav Shimon Maaseh b'Tavi Avdo. And here we have a fascinating Gemara. So we had Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon recounted a story. He told the story. Rav Shimon is a big rabbi, a Talmud Chacham, and he says over, and Rav Shimon tells a story of something. He records a conversation of Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel was saying over a conversation. What was the conversation? That Rabbi Gamliel says that Tavi, the slave who was a slave of Rabbi Gamliel, was sleeping under the bed in the sukkah. Instead of sleeping on top of a bed in the sukkah, he went underneath the bed in the sukkah of Rabbi Gamliel, and he slept underneath the bed. And Rabbi Gamliel told the rabbis, do you see my Eved, my servant, Rabbi Tavi, is a Talmud Chacham. He's a learned person, and he knows that avodim, that servants, that slaves, are patur from a sukkah. He knows that they're exempt from a sukkah. Because he knows that they have no obligation to sleep in a sukkah. Now, why does a slave not have an obligation? Because a slave is obligated in mitzvos like a woman. A woman is not obligated to to eat in a sukkah, sleep in a sukkah, even though she gets great reward if she goes and stays and eats and drinks and sleeps in a sukkah. She's not obligated. It's a time-bound mitzvah. Sukkah comes once a year. I mean, the holiday of Sukkot is once a year. So therefore, she's exempt from a sukkah. And since the servant has the same status as a woman when it comes to halacha, so therefore he went ahead and he slept not on top of the bed, or he slept underneath the bed, because he had no obligation to sleep in a sukkah. So Rabbi Gamliel is pointing out a phenomenon about his slave Tavid. Now, the Gemara is going to say that even though Rabbi Gamliel, sometimes a rabbi, most of the time in the Gemara, a rabbi says a law. He goes and he says a specific law. Here, Rabbi Gamliel is telling a story. From the story, you can learn out the law. Because Rabbi Gamliel is telling, look what my slave did. He slept underneath the bed. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Shimon says we could see from the conversation of the rabbi, from the story, from what the rabbi is saying, we could see we can learn certain things. So now the Gemara is going to come to say that it's not only what the rabbi says, comes and says, I want to tell you a law that you have what to learn from. Even his conversation, when the rabbi says a conversation, says that makes an observation, even though he didn't say it in a way of like a normal, I want to tell you the law, but the conversation of a rabbi, there's what to learn from. There's depth, there's something there that's behind everything the rabbi says, and you need to look into the conversation and be able to pick up certain laws or certain things that you could learn from. That's what the Gemara is going to say. That's what the Gemara is going to observe, the points, the morning of the conversation of a rabbi. So that's what the Gemara is going to say. Amar of Shimon, Tanya, Amar of Shimon. Meisichato she'Rabbi Gamliel. So first he says, Rabbi Shimon says, from the conversation of Rabbi Gamliel, lamadnu shnei dvarim. We learned two things, two laws. Lamadnu she'avadim patur min sukkah. We learn out that a slave is exempt from sleeping from a sukkah. That's what we see from Rabbi Gamliel's conversation. And number two, during the holiday of Sukkot, he has no responsibility to sleep in a sukkah. He has to keep Shabbat, the slave. Remember, the slave means a Gentile that was bought by a Jew. We're not talking about a Jew from birth. Jew from birth, slave is obligated in all mitzvot. We're talking about a non-Jew bought by a Jew, goes through the mikveh process, goes through the circumcision process, and he accepts upon himself the mitzvot, but he's still not obligated in all the mitzvot yet. He still has a status, as long as he's a slave, as an only obligated in mitzvot like a woman. Once he becomes free, he's obligated in all mitzvot. I want to wish everyone have a great day. You too.